Thanks a lot. So thanks to everybody for sticking around, and also massive thanks to the organisers of the conference for such a great day and for inviting me along. I initially, when I started writing this talk, I thought I'll do something very different. I'll talk to everybody about design processes, because that won't come up in the rest of the conference, which I think I was a bit wrong, because we've heard some fantastic talks today about how people have been kind of going through the process of designing these technologies. So hopefully this talk might tie some of those things together that we've already heard. And also it might just kind of repeat some stuff, but sometimes it's good to hear things twice from different voices. That's what I'm telling myself anyway. So here's the outline of the talk. First of all, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges kind of in working in this kind of interdisciplinary area. I'm going to talk about design research specifically as being an interdisciplinary way of kind of doing research. Some of the problems created by software engineering, and then a little bit about iterative design, evaluation, and finally get to what I really wanted to talk about, which is this idea of experience, about how we use this idea of experience in the design and evaluation process of technology and how that makes things better. Okay, so as I'm sure anyone who's working in this field has already realised, making useful, usable mHealth technology is a very difficult task, right? Requiring many different skills of many different stakeholders. So we've kind of seen lots of different contributions throughout the day of how different configurations of, for example, health professionals, psychologists, users, software engineers, etc., have kind of come together in these projects. So it's difficult to work together productively, really, in this kind of way when we have such different goals, working practices, philosophies, and terminology. So often the people working on the projects don't share any of those things, which brings lots of kind of misunderstandings and inefficiencies. I don't have a solution to that. Obviously, that's just an issue, and we have to deal with it, and it's just hard. So the interesting thing then is that, you know, kind of reading through the literature, you see that there are kind of very different disciplines aimed at often at doing the same thing. Okay, so we see mHealth, which is part of, you know, eHealth and health psychology and health research. We see kind of health informatics, which is a different thing, but it's done with the same intention to support healthcare and health services. And then from where I kind of come from, you know, in terms of my academic discipline, which is more about design, so we call it designing for health and well-being, really. So there's these different fields, and actually I meant to mention at the start, yeah. So the unique thing about this talk, I suppose, is that my research is based in human-computer interaction, which is a sub-discipline of computer science. So I worked for years in England in a computer science department, first as a researcher, and then as a lecturer, working on kind of e-health and mHealth stuff, as well as educational technology. But so we looked at these different disciplines, and the interesting thing is that there's kind of different configurations of sub-disciplines in them. So for example, in mHealth you probably see lots of health professionals and psychologists, and probably less productive kind of contributions from, for example, like designers, and you often see computer science used as a tool rather than as a focus of the research. In health informatics, probably the other way around. It's all about developing cool technology and interfacing with business and economics and that kind of thing, with probably less contributions from, say, psychologists or designers. And then in design, obviously mainly designers, our problem in design is that it's very difficult to run clinical trials when you're a designer. And actually, I worked in the UK, and a lot of our funding was from the EPSRC, the Physical Sciences Research Council, and they actually, for years, specifically didn't allow you to do anything that could be considered medical research if you got money from them. So they said that if it's medical research, you should go to the MRC. So what you find is you find these kind of silos developing. But within those silos, we're improving different parts, I would say, of the process of developing useful interventions, but we're just not very good at kind of talking to each other about it. I've often kind of noticed that the design-focused research is kind of absent. Well, like this conference has kind of proved that wrong, to be honest, from the mHealth projects. But I suppose it's rare that the design is the interesting part of the process, I would say. and that seems to be changing, which is fantastic. So, but design is specifically interested in developing methods for turning theories and ideas into software that works. So that's why I think it's really important that we focus on design, and other people have made that argument already today. Another point about design is that many of the challenges arising in mHealth research have kind of arisen in other disciplines already. So, for example, assistive technology, it provides a really nice analogy in that assistive technology has been around for about, we've been using wearables in assistive technology for 20 years. And often in assistive technology, and this actually answers one of the questions that was raised earlier about why we focus so much on design instead of just focusing on the outcomes, is that there's a long history in assistive technology of really brilliant technology being made that nobody ever uses, okay? So it's really important to make sure that we're making things that people value, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. Also, a lot of people today have talked about involving users, but not very much about what you're doing with those users. What are you actually doing when you get those people in the room? So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And this idea of whether those users actually have a voice, whether they have power in that design process, and in what way you kind of facilitate that. So obviously, this paper was fantastic. I only read it a few weeks ago actually, and this is actually one of the other points that kind of backs up the point that I've already made, is that I hadn't come across this paper yet, and it was only Emer Morrissey who actually pointed it out to me there a few weeks ago. When I looked through the papers that you guys cited in this, I think there's 82 papers cited. I'd only read one or two of those papers previously, which shows, well, it in some ways might show that I'm a bit ignorant of this stuff, but I don't want that to be the point. It shows that we're kind of reading different stuff, basically, even though we're kind of interested in the same thing. And an interesting parallel to that then is this paper, which is produced by some computer scientists working at Trinity about 6 years ago, Gavin Doherty and David Coyle, and they've done kind of a similar thing. What they've done is try to explain how mental health care works to computer scientists. So this paper kind of lays out, well, here's all the things you need to think about when you're developing technology for the mental health domain, and it does it specifically to computer scientists. And Gavin and David, actually, their work, it was kind of the basis for I don't know if people have heard of Silver Cloud Health. It's been one of the kind of more successful Irish companies in mHealth, or eHealth, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. I don't know how much time I've spent because I forgot to start my clock. So design research. As computers have moved from the office to the home to our pockets and wrists, the way that we study them has changed. Okay, we don't take people into the lab anymore and just do quantitative questionnaires with them. We've entirely changed our practices as designers. So originally we would have thought of technology as tools that are supposed to support a specific task. The question remains like, well, what task does Snapchat solve? Our understanding of why Snapchat is valuable, it doesn't, it's really difficult to understand that from a cognitive psychology point of view. So we're now interested in concepts like context. What does that mean? Embodiment, appropriation, values, and experiences. And these are the kinds of things that we explore when we're designing technology. So you might ask then, given the vast range of contexts and experiences that we study, like as part of design research, what have we learned that you could actually take then when applied to your projects? And really, and it's a point that was well made by Linehan Morrison there previously, is that the process through which we make things is really important. Okay, so we've really learned to focus on the process rather than the content. Excuse me. So we might kind of imagine that like there's a stereotypical process through which software gets made, and this isn't purely about health technology. It kind of parallels any situation in which you're paying a software company to make software for you. Okay, so I suppose you kind of come up with your idea. In this case, do a literature review of how interventions work in a face-to-face session, make some decisions about how it might work via a mobile platform, do some sort of brief pilot work, hand it over to a company, get it back, and then you figure out whether it works or not. Okay, so this was a kind of like the original model of how we kind of saw software developing. And there's obviously problems with that, right? I think we need to move away from research processes designed to establish whether things work and towards processes that are designed towards ensuring that they work. Okay, so this is, and you know, it's a point that's been made many times, so I won't labour over it. But it's really important that we. A nice analogy is psychometrics for any psychologists here, where if you're designing like an IQ test. You keep making it until it definitely works, right? And that's the kind of attitude, I suppose, that we want to see with this kind of stuff. So it's not efficient to find out there's issues with design of an mHealth intervention after someone has spent 6 months developing it. We need to ways of doing that before we hand it over. And I would argue that some of the blame comes from methods through which software gets made, and particularly that it's a very convenient method that software companies like to work on, where you give them requirements and then they just make it and then give it back to you, basically. And it's called the waterfall method. If you ever hear that in a software meeting, if they're talking about using the waterfall method, tell them that you have a better idea. So what we prefer to see is something like this, okay? Where it's the same elements, but that they're just configured in a different way. So you gather requirements, come up to your design, implement it, evaluate it, and then the evaluation is not designed to see whether it works or not. It's designed to find the problems in it, where you fix them, you go back, change the requirements, redesign it, go through again and again and again until it definitely works, right? That's the kind of model that we prefer to see. I know it's not always possible, but if we do that as much as possible. The nice thing is, the more of this you do before it goes to software, the more chance, the cheaper that is. So you can do it with paper prototypes or with these kind of lightweight apps that exist for doing templates and frameworks online. We can use those to simulate how an app might work, rather than without having to build a thing, have it work in practice. So that's just kind of a very brief run through how I think design should work, and it's not just my opinion. This is how design research has gone. This is what we understand as best practice in design. Also, the processes through which we evaluate our tools limits what we can learn about them. Okay, so it's really important that we use appropriate processes to evaluate our tools, and generally there's multiple levels of questions and require multiple different types of evaluation strategies. So I have this fantastic diagram, which actually is rendered here even worse than it was when I made it. This idea that there's a kind of a hierarchy of how useful things are. So you can make some software that's like technically valid, it technically does the job that it's supposed to do, and then the next kind of thing up is, can people actually use it? And the next more complicated thing to figure out is whether people actually find it useful. So the difference between whether you can use something and whether you actually find it useful, and then the next big jump then is whether people actually use the thing or not. So I'll just quickly run through this because I think I'm a bit behind. If you're interested in technical validity, the kind of thing, say, you might be interested in doing there is, if you're making a step counter, is it measuring steps accurately, right? That's the kind of question we're talking about at that level. The next level up, lab studies. What you find there about your app is that people find it frustrating, they find it confusing, it's causing them too much cognitive load. And then the next level up, doing kind of field trials, and what we learned there is about their kind of people's values, experiences, and practices. And I think what we've kind of learned in design is that this is really the crucial bit. Okay, is really understanding what people value, because they're not. If you can't assume they're going to value your app if you don't know what they value, right? So, how does your technology fit within? Or how does the technology that you're developing fit within your life, your hobbies, your family, your work, that kind of stuff? And that's the kind of questions that we would ask in these processes, rather than asking people to speculate about what they might like or how they might like things to work. So we find out about their life rather than asking them to speculate. So I'll give you just a little example of that. This is a project that I was involved in a few years ago over in England, where we were interested in making a platform for delivering CBT for insomnia online. As part of that, we thought it would be a good idea to know how well people were sleeping. So we developed a mobile app for Android that could measure sleep. So there was lots of different challenges in this, so I'll just kind of go through the process that we used. So on a most basic level, does it measure sleep quality in a valid and reliable manner? So if it's not doing that, it's absolutely pointless, okay? Secondly, can people use the interface without errors? Do they need help? Can they set and reset sleep and wake up times? So this is the first thing we tested. We did a lab study to evaluate that. As soon as we were happy that people could understand how it worked, and that there was multiple iterations on that, we moved on to doing an in the wild trial, which is a field study where people used it in their bedrooms. At that point, sorry, my phone is making that noise. We were interested in, does the app interrupt people's sleep? Right, really important question. How do they feel about recording their sleep and their partner's sleep data? Until this point, we kind of forgot that people don't tend to sleep alone, and that had the potential to cause lots and lots of different issues about recording and privacy and all of these kinds of things. And then, for example, do people remember to use it over the longer term? On the kind of longer term evaluation then, is it still used when the trial is over? Does behaviour actually change? So the point here is that there's lots of different questions and they have to be answered in lots of different ways. There's no one trial that's going to answer all of these questions, right? So I think that was an important point to make, and that's the paper that reported all of that work. So it kind of reports in 2 or 3 different studies in it. Okay, moving on. Experience. So this is kind of the title of the talk, so I probably should mention it. In order to make mobile technology that is useful, we must consider the values, experiences, practices of users throughout the design process. So what we're really interested in is how is this technology going to fit within, interrupt, challenge, or enrich people's lives. So we need to get an idea of that. Is it going to interrupt the things that they're already doing? Is it going to cause them problems? Or is it going to in some way make their life better? As soon as you kind of start thinking, right, I want to design really nice experiences for people, then you run into these kinds of problems of how do we design experiences? How do we evaluate experiences? What do you even mean by experience, right? So that's a good question. I've said that word probably about 100 times at this stage. Should probably mention that. And actually, in the field of design, there's been lots of people have thought about this for a long time. What do we mean by experience? And actually there's some fantastic books written by the Professor of Psychology at UCC, John McCarthy, on this exact topic. He'd be delighted for the plug. So the first one, the one on the left there, Experience Centered Design, is a really accessible kind of book, and I would recommend anyone who's involved in a design project to pick that up. It's only 100 pages long, and it really summarises these issues very well. The one on the right is kind of if you're interested in reading about the philosophy of experience, which some people are. So what does it mean? What does it mean doing design on an experiential level? Well, on a practical level, it means what we would expect in any sort of user-centered design kind of scenario. Regular contact and constructive dialogue with all stakeholders. Qualitative research, similar to what the people at Southampton do. Lots of qualitative research at all phases. But that qualitative research should be aimed towards understanding people's experiences, okay? Not about their attitudes or these kinds of things. It's specifically about what is your experience of your life and how can we make things that you will value. So not asking people to speculate, that kind of thing. And then it's about rapid iteration, like I discussed earlier. And there is a whole kind of theoretical level behind it as well, which I'm not going to go into in massive detail, but it's not as if we're kind of just making this up as we go along. There's like a long history of research on how to do this. So at lunchtime I realised I should probably put in some examples of some methods that you might use. So I kind of spent my lunchtime frantically revising these slides. So one of the things we might want to do is understand what behaviour looks like in context, right? So there's lots of different methods that we can use to do that. So again, if we're interested in making technology that fits within people's lives, we should know something about their lives, okay? You could ask them give them a questionnaire, tell me something about your life, but actually there's lots of different research methods that have been developed that are really useful for doing this. So for example, ethnography is something that has been, it's quite a surprise to a lot of people, but actually there's lots of ethnographers working in computer science at the moment. And it's about understanding how people currently go about their life and studying that in a kind of ecologically valid way in order to then understand how technology can then fit within that life so you're not causing them to break their routines or to do things that they don't want to do. And a lot of that has come from, say, developing technology that, for example, fits within the healthcare system. If you're designing an app for a nurse to use as they're going about their daily routine, then how do they go about that routine normally? Right. Or you might use diary studies. So people have mentioned diary studies already today. They're pretty useful. Or photo logging, life logging, these kinds of things. So if you're interested, there was a mention of context earlier, Felix Naughton's talk. So if you're interested in making a contextually responsive intervention, you must understand something about the context, and I think so. You did a nice job of that. But again, like, context is something that has been thought about at length in the field of design. And there's this fantastic book here called Where the Action Is by a guy called Paul Durish. Where the Action Is, the Foundations of Embodied Interaction. And so for anybody who's doing some work that's really interested in considering the context in which behaviour is taking place, this really gives us lots of tools to help us think about that process. So this is like a kind of classic paper that I want to present to you now. It's not something that I've done myself, although I wish it was. So this is a project that was carried out in the early 90s by a company called IDEO, I think you pronounce it. And they were designing defibrillating pacemakers. So a defibrillating pacemaker is like a pacemaker that would be inserted in your chest and would actually shock your heart when it recognised that something was going wrong. So the company made the technology, it worked, but then before they were going to release it on the market, they thought, well, how will this actually work in context? How will this affect people's lives? So what they did was they did a study which involved beepers. Do you remember beepers? Yeah, so like so you wear on your chest and you get like a beep which would tell you normally to go and answer a phone call. So they used beepers, diaries and cameras. And the idea of the study was that they used the beepers to simulate the use of a defibrillating pacemaker. So when a person got a beep, they had to stop everything that they were doing and write down, where am I, what am I doing, who's around me, and then basically the researchers took that information and instead of asking people, what about their acceptability and whether they would value a defibrillating pacemaker, the researchers looked at where those people were in what kind of context when those shocks would have happened. And then they used that as a way of understanding how to signal to people that they were about to get a shock so that they could take some action. So for example, if they were walking down some stairs, or if they were or if they were holding a child or something like that, that you really wouldn't want to get shocked while you were doing one of those things. So the importance of signaling. So that's what, again, so being interested in that kind of experience at that level was like massively useful in that kind of case. And that's that paper there. It's a really nice method actually. It's been used again and again since, about taking snapshots of behavior in context. So if you're developing technology that's designed to affect people in context, then that method is something really useful. We've heard kind of focus groups mentioned quite a lot. Remember, the questions that we're trying to answer is how technology will fit within, interrupt, challenge, or enrich your life. That's kind of what we need to know in order to make the things seem valuable to people so that they'll actually use them. Focus groups are a structure for doing research in which you can actually waste a lot of time, right? A lot of times they're not very useful. Through design research, what people have kind of uncovered or decided is that using kind of prompts and props to encourage participants to express something about their life and their experiences, that's useful. But asking, again, I've mentioned it before, asking people to speculate about what they might want in future is just not useful. It's rare that turns into something. So a lot of times people say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, but actually in practice they then, they don't use the thing in the way that they said they would in the focus group. So again, there's lots of research on how to do focus groups in a really constructive way around the development of technology. So just kind of pointing in that direction. And then prototype evaluation. So it's really people use them for usability testing, which is fantastic. It's also really good as a means of communication. So if you've got one of these interdisciplinary teams that involves people with very different expertises, one of the best ways of communicating how you would like something to work is to give them a prototype. So that's a really nice way of kind of communicating with a software company, but it's also a nice way of communicating with users. So instead of getting a list of things that you would like the tool to do, talking prototypes, get them to design them for you, you design them for them, that kind of stuff. Okay, so the point is really to invite participants to creatively express something about themselves, their values, their relationships, and the ways they make sense of experience. To elicit personally meaningful reflections, to understand how people experience and make sense of situations, relationships, and life events. And so basically we found that this is a really useful approach to designing technology for people. How long do I have left? 5, great. That means I can go on to some of my own research. So this is a study that was carried out with, that's a colleague of mine, Catherine Gerling, on the right hand side, and we were interested in using the Nintendo Wii. Actually, this photo for some reason has the Kinect in it, but we actually used a Wii, Nintendo Wii, to encourage older adults in residential care to get a bit more exercise or move around a bit more. Okay, so can we make games that would encourage people to do that? What we found is a lot of people did do it, and they found it fun and a kind of interesting social activity. From our quantitative analysis, it looked like something that did encourage an increase in movement on average among people. But we also found from doing a kind of very experiential evaluation, which involved really being in the residential care quite a lot, that a lot of people actually found it a very negative experience. Okay, and there's a reason for that. So playing in a social setting, the idea of playing a video game with lots of your people that you're living with surrounding you, anyone who's played a lot of games will know that games require learning. So the first time you pick up a game, you're generally not very good at it, and if you were, that's probably not a very good game. They also require a lot of failure. So when you're playing a game, you fail all the time, right? The problem is, if you ask people who are already feeling a bit self-conscious or lack of self-efficacy, like over their own abilities to do something like this in public, that can cause lots of negative feelings. And what we found was we were working with prototype games and things that weren't yet brilliant, I'll put it that way. A lot of the times they attributed their failure at the game not to the game being rubbish, but to them no longer being able to do these kinds of things. Okay, so we actually created a very negative experience for a lot of people. And we've reported that in detail, so hopefully nobody else does it again. But like the point I want to make there is that being really interested in their experience rather than looking at just outcomes. Really, we learned a lot from that, and hopefully people will learn from our mistakes as well. And that's in the paper that reports all that work. How long do I have left? 2 minutes. Okay, one more project. So this project there is an existing therapy that worked for adult stroke victims who had problems with vision based on damage to their visual cortex. And so there was basically on the left-hand side here, you see this really basic kind of psychophysics experiment. So people use that as a way of training an improvement in functional vision. Nobody knows how that works, but it seems to work. In our project, we were interested to see could we do something similar for children, and so we kind of went through this process where we made this kind of very colourful game. It has very like bright colours and very simple shapes and that kind of thing. And we were interested to see would that actually work. But also, the interesting thing I think about this was the design process. So we actually, we had a researcher who worked in the school full time for 2 years. And again, a lot of the findings in this paper are about our own failures and what we would hope people don't do again. One of the really interesting things was that we found that people who were legally blind were actually really good at playing the game. And given that the game didn't really have any sound effects, it was quite an unusual finding. But what that did was it kind of gave everyone a better understanding of the specific kind of disabilities that people had, including like their parents, their carers, their therapists. What we really found from that project was that there's a really fine line for that group between a game that is too simple, that's a stupid game, right? Because kids have high expectations of games. There's a really fine line between a game that's really boring for them and a game that's completely impossible because they can't see what's going on in the game. So again, the whole point here is that like being interested in the experience of the people and having that as a core part of that development process before you go and make the final piece of software. Often that's what's been the most useful thing in our kind of studies that are around developing technology for health. Okay, so the takeaway message: carrying out methodical design work is essential to the ultimate quality of the intervention. Often you'll find that, you know, if there's no designer on the team, that's generally the psychologist who'll have to do it, right? If you don't take responsibility for doing this stuff, I don't understand. Like the software company won't do it, the software engineer won't do it. So you know, being interested in this stuff, and it's really encouraging to see that it does seem to be being taken up not as only necessary but also interesting part of the process of developing these interventions. So then understanding experiences, values, day-to-day practices of stakeholders allows us to make things that are acceptable, useful and valuable to them, and that's all I wanted to say.